You know, not every Vulcan that live long gets to prosper. Let's go ahead and fix that. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I want to welcome you all today to this episode of Old Tank Repair. For this episode, we have here this vintage Italeri 1/35 scale M163 Vulcan self-propelled anti-aircraft gun. Just like with many of the other smaller scale builds on this channel, this model here is built for my own personal collection and is not for sale and/or purchase. However, like I often mention in these videos, I frequently take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35 scale and 1/6 scale. For availability and pricing information, that information will be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@EastCoastArmory.com. Just like with the other builds in the OTR lineup, this model here was built several decades ago, and over the years have fallen into a poor state of disrepair. In this video, I'm going to be taking this model from that starting condition and be giving it a complete teardown and restoration to the condition that we see here. Along the way, I'm going to show several tips and techniques that went into the build, bringing it up to the following condition. Because of all this information, this will be a longer format video, so I recommend either watching it in sections or possibly hitting the little gear icon in the corner in order to speed it up. Regardless, let's go ahead and take a step back to when this model was first started so we get a good idea on what the condition was of this model at the beginning of the rebuild. And here we have the model at the start of the rebuild. For the candidate today, we have a 1/35 scale 1990s vintage M163 Vulcan from Italeri. This model here is another one of the kits that were built in my youth. This model here I built back in the year 1996, 97 or so. And, you know, basically in that sweet spot area. And I believe I was about 11 going on 12 at the time. This kit was actually one of the first tank kits I purchased from our local hobby shop. And it has a, similar story to some of the other ones that I've mentioned before. Basically, this kit was something that we picked up just on the fly. It was it was a school night. It was right after we had dinner. My dad and I decided to just go on a small road trip, basically just go cruising, spend some quality time together. And we drove to the hobby shop, and it was the first time we really went to this place. And it was, really cool, seeing this place as a kid. The hobby shop in question is Trains and Lanes Hobbies. Just give them a quick little plug. They're out in Pennsylvania. And we went there, and my dad's like, just like similar with the Fist story, he goes, John, go and pick something that you like. I'm going to go and, look at some other stuff. And if you see something, pick it up, and I'll pick it up for you. So I'm like, all right. So I go to the armor aisle. And I'm just looking around, and first thing, I steer clear away from the Dragon tank kits for reasons that we all should know by now. And I, wander into the Italeri section, and, well, just looking at the selection, and this kit here just caught my eye. I'm holding the kit in my hand, and I'm just appreciating the box art. And by the way, the box art for this kit is really, really cool, and they still basically use the same box art today. It was re-released a little while ago. The vehicle is sitting on a street, has some really cool camouflage foliage on it, and it has, this particular one had that really cool 1990s Italeri typography on it, and it's just, it's just something that caught my eye. This was actually, I believe, the second M113 kit that I built. The kit itself, I was a big fan of the M113 platform. I dug the shape of it. And of course, this one's really cool because it has a Vulcan on it. I mean, you put a Vulcan on anything, it's instantly going to make it cooler. And I'm like, wow, this is looks to be a really cool tank. The vehicle was made by Italeri, and at the time, I've already built maybe one or two Italeri kits before. I built one of their Shermans, and I've seen the old Verleiden books, and he built nothing but Italeris. So I figured, hey, they have, single piece vinyl tracks. This is going to be a great little build. So I showed it to my father. He's like, all right, cool. We brought it up to the cash register, rung us up. And then when I went to the car, the first thing I did, like I always do, is I took a letter opener and I opened up the saran wrap to see what the kit contents were. And my post-purchase euphoria was instantly doused with a massive teaspoon of disappointment, because this kit here was one that gives you the lovely individual link and length tracks. Yes, and by the way, if anyone have ever watched my other model rebuild videos, you'll probably see a recurring theme here. However, I decided to suck it up and muscle through, primarily because the store doesn't offer refunds. They just do store credit only. So basically I was stuck with it. And on top of that, it's still a really cool vehicle on top of that. So, I can basically build it. And what's great about the M113 is that the side skirt covers up the top portion of the track, so you don't have to worry about that portion, so I thought. And on top of that, my father volunteered to build the tracks for me because, he's my dad and, he could do no wrong. So I got the model home. I went to bed that night because it was a school night. Then the next day, I believe it was a Saturday, I went ahead, or I should say it was, the next Saturday that rose up, I went ahead and started the build, and I built the model basically to the condition that we see it here. The paint job was painted by my father. At the time, I was really sketchy or completely non-existent with an airbrush. The airbrush that we had at the period was a single-action Poshy airbrush, and it was not really the best. And on top of that, we also didn't have a really good air compressor. Like I've stated in a few other videos, when it comes for painting, you need a good quality airbrush combined with a good quality air compressor. Those little hobby grade ones, they're junk, and basically you're not going to get PSI to power the thing. So this was basically the paintwork that my dad did on it at the time. He went for a Merc camouflage pattern. My dad was a big fan of the Merc seams, and that's basically what you see here, or an attempt at it. At the time, I really didn't think the paint job was too bad. I wasn't in love with it, but, it didn't really bother me. Then he decided to tackle the tracks because, they were well outside my skill range, and I figured, my dad could do it because, he's awesome at everything. So I had him build the tracks, and, to his credit, he did build the tracks and built them as good as he can, which, by the way, this is the quality that you get with Lincoln Lane tracks, which is why they're trash, and I absolutely hate them. So after the model was built, it just basically sat in my display case along with many of the other tanks I was building at the time, and there it just sat and sat and sat and sat. Fast forward to 2021, I've been rebuilding a lot and revisiting a lot of my older kits, and this one here just seemed like a perfect candidate. The Fist V as well as the Australian M113 were literally sitting right next to it, so I might as well just burn through the list and get to this one as well. Outside of the paint job and the Lincoln Lane tracks, I went ahead and built a few mistakes into this build, which are something that I am going to have to take care of during the rebuilding process. So let's go ahead and dive in to see some of these issues that I am going to have to correct. Okay, well, it's a given that the tracks are going to be pitched. That's not something that's going to stick. However, outside of the tracks, you'll see that the running gear on the Italeri M113s, the torsion bars were separate molded pieces, and they need to get assembled in a straight line. Well, 11 or 12-year-old John did the best he could. A few of the wheels are canted slightly, so this is going to have to be addressed. Luckily, this model here is built with Tesser's red tube model glue, which, as I've stated in a few other builds, when it comes for doing a rebuild like this, is fantastic because that red tube glue falls apart after a decade or so. And with this model here being old enough to buy alcohol at this point, the bonds of the glue should give way fairly easily, and I should be able to then properly reassemble the suspension in a way that's more representable. The model itself is mostly there. It's missing a few pieces here or there. The brush guard here for the exhaust looks to be improperly assembled or damaged at some point, so this is going to have to be slightly reworked. It's pretty easy to do. If anything, I'll probably just replace it with a scratch built one like I've done on the other builds. On the back here, you'll see that I'm missing that little protective brush guard that looks like a handle for the tail light. The tail lights, however, are in their proper locations, and I do have all of the tools on this build. The jerry cans are still there, the tow cable, the Pioneer tools, and also the 20mm ammo cans, which literally just pop. By the way, this is why you don't use red tube, people, on your brand new build. For this build, it's great, but this is why. The piece, by the way, this is not pre-planned. It just fell apart in my hands just now. So it's not scripted. The tools are all there. Obviously, they're probably going to come off with hardly any effort, just like the ammo cans did. The headlights are all in their proper locations, and they're all present. The brush guards don't seem to be wonky or anything. However, one thing that's interesting to point out, and this isn't my fault, this is the fault with the kit, involves the blackout light here on the front headlight cluster. If you look really, really closely at the blackout light, you'll see that it's mounted upside down. But again, this is as per the kit. This is not, my mistake or anything. It's just the way the kit's molded. So the Italeri, if you have an Italeri M113, you might want to pay attention to that because that is something that can definitely hurt the look of your build. Moving upward, it looks like I am missing one of the lift handles found on this corner of the hull. I believe this might be installed in the wrong place, but you know, we'll see as I actually dig into it. The other lift rings seem to be in decent condition. They don't seem broken like they were on some of the other M113s that I've done in the past. The model also doesn't have extensive dremeled in weld beads like what was seen on the other older builds that I've mentioned before, where I took a Dremel, I just basically went over the edges over here to, you know, make some weld beads. That doesn't seem to be the case. They are there. It looks like that procedure was done, but were done in a much more minuscule format. Because of that, cleaning this up should be fairly easy. One thing, though, that does concern me a little bit involves the side ballast tanks that we have here. If I'm not mistaken, I believe these might be mounted in the wrong locations. I think they might be slightly too low compared to where they need to be, but this is something I need to look into and possibly even address. Honestly, this is something that might throw a curveball, because if these don't come off, I'm going to have to try to just amputate them. Luckily, the M163, at some point, many of the units ditched the side ballast tanks on them, so if I have to amputate them, it's not going to be a complete loss, but it's really not something I want to actively do. But again, we'll have to see once the rebuild commences. The front bow plane seems to be okay. Apparently, it doesn't look like it's been glued on the right location, because there's a small little hole that we have here. That's something that's going to need some investigating. And that's really it for the hull. Compared to the other ones, this one here, it's really not in that dire of a condition outside of the crappy tracks and the paint job that needs to be revised. Moving up to the turret, this is something that has bugged me about this build since I first built it. You see, the M163 from Italeri has this weird, not glitch, but weird quirk to it, where it involves the 20mm Vulcan. The Vulcan itself is actually pretty decently rendered. Even it has some minor interior detailing that we have here. And that's all well and good. But the problem is with the way the elevation is rendered. You see, with the way the kit is, you have two options to render the Vulcan. Option one is to have the Vulcan pointed up, and option two is in its downward state that we have here. And honestly, I didn't like either position. The position where the Vulcan was pointing up was too high. It was actually like almost vertical like that. And this version here, it's too low. So it's one of the, again, it's probably one of the biggest dings I have on the Italeri M163. Outside of that, some of the struts, well, looks like they're falling off because of the old glue, which is good for me, by the way. They need to be corrected and adjusted. Some of the pieces, they didn't look like they were properly installed when I first built the kit. So again, hopefully it's good that the pieces start disassembling on me, because it'll just make my job a bit easier. On this rebuild, however, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to revise the hydraulic systems that we have here. I believe these are dampeners on the real unit, and this is why the unit can pivot up and down, because these hydraulic pieces would either be too high or too low, like I just mentioned. So for this one here, what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to amputate this section on either side, replace the thinner portion so that the unit can be somewhere in the middle, where I think it looks a lot better compared to its drooped format that is represented on this build right now. But again, this is something that, you know, it's really a coming attraction for this build. Outside of the gun, we have the small little radio integrally molded into there. We have an MP65 porcelain antenna base right here. The detailing is actually pretty good on it. It is bent, but keep in mind on the real unit, this part would be rubber and it would actually be flexible. So that's something I may or may not keep. You know, it depends if it survives the paint stripping process, which is a bit harsh on small pieces like that. But, you know, again, we'll just see how that turns out. The radar also looks to be in decent shape. It doesn't seem to be installed inaccurate or anything like that, and honestly, I think it should polish up pretty well. If anyone's wondering why there are rubber bands on the model here, well, that's because when I took it out of the cabinet, I went ahead and saw some parts that started falling off. Of course, you know, old glues and all. If I take the one rubber band off, you can see that the side screw promptly departed, and here you can see the individual link and link track now falling apart like cat litter or clumped up cat litter in my hands, which is great. Again, that's actually unironically great, because this stuff is not going to be kept. And on this one here, let me just move that. And of course, the rear door was also broken. The funny thing is, this rear door was fully functional for about 2 decades, but the second I started to look at it and evaluate, see if it's viable for a rebuild, the hinges broke on me. So, you know, typical. Also, like I mentioned in the other M113 videos, this is so far literally the 3rd M113 variant that I've rebuilt, and on all 3 of them, a common reoccurring thing is the rear ramp getting broken on them. These components on just about all these plastic models are so very fragile. It's great that they make them functional, but the hinge work on these pieces are so small that they can break with just the littlest of effort. So it's always something you really want to pay attention to on your 113 builds. On the model here, you'll note that I went ahead and spray painted the inside with flat white. I figured you might see some of that through the turret that we have over here, which of course is open top. There is no other detailing found on the interior portion here. It's just a cavernous space. On the original Italeri 113, which is the standard APC version, that vehicle I believe does have full interior detailing. However, this isn't just the end of it, because I also have a small little bag here of other parts that fell off when, well, I was taking it out of the cabinet. In this parts bag, we really have just 2 parts, so that's really cool. We have here a brush guard for the radar. This was just a clean break, so reassembly of this should be very easy. And we also have one of those indicator strobe lights. This one here, unlike the Academy version, which in my opinion was a superior piece to this, the Academy one was 2 pieces. You had an opaque plastic for the stem, then you had this clear plastic dome that went on top. On the Italeri one, it's just molded 1 piece, and it's just opaque plastic. It is workable. You can just, you know, replicate the orange dome coloring on it with some paint or with some painting techniques. For this one here, I kind of botched it up. I spray painted it with a can of orange from, I believe it was like hunting camo or something like that. And it kind of, you can see how it was sitting down on the surface I was spray painting it on. So will this be able to be cleaned up? I don't know. I'm going to try to give it a shot, you know, see if I can pull it off. But if it's not salvageable, it's no big deal, as these pieces were removable and were not generally found on these vehicles outside of road use. So that's really it. From this point here, we could go to the shop where I can start the paint stripping process. You see, unlike the Sherman or that Panzer III that I've rebuilt, where those builds needed to have a pre-wash before I could even strip the paint off, for this one here, that's just not going to be the case. You see, like with the other 113s, this model here was kept in a relatively dust-free environment. It was in this book display case type setting where I have my older builds. And although that system is not dust proof by any means, the type of dust that you get in there is this fine powdery dust that it's like almost impossible to wash off without scrubbing it, as opposed to the other dust where we see on the vehicles that were left exposed, where it was that thick, disgusting blanket of sorts going on. So because of that, the pre-wash for this one is just not necessary, and we can just go directly into the denatured alcohol bath and start the paint stripping process. Oof. Yeah, and the model does smell like it's been in a dark recess of the shop for a very long time. So that's something that the denatured alcohol will easily eviscerate. Of course, the first thing I'm going to do is going to be stripping off the paint. One thing I forgot to point out before is that the model is painted with a bunch of acrylic paints. I believe they're either Tamiya or mixed between Tamiya and or Model Master. Regardless of which, the acrylic is very susceptible for being removed with the denatured alcohol bath that I've already showcased in a few other rebuild videos. The first thing that I am going to do is I'm going to add some weights to the inside of the model because, as I've mentioned before, these plastic models have a habit on floating when they're placed in some kind of a liquid type solution. For this vehicle here, it's going to be really, really easy because of that gigantic axis that we have here on the back. So I just went around the shop, found some random bits of mass to put on the inside. That pulley should do the job, but yes, have an old fitting over here, as well as a few more fittings. This should be plenty enough to weigh the model down. In order to keep the stuff from falling out, what I am going to do is I'm going to take the rear door and I'm just going to rubber band it in place just like the way I had it earlier. This will be able to keep everything on the inside, keep the model weighted down, and I'll also be stripping the paint off of the rear door as well. While on that note, I might as well throw the other bits of equipment on the inside here, just so I know where everything is. And basically the vehicle itself acts as a capsule, holding everything at bay. The only thing I'm not going to strip the paint off are these sections of individual Lincoln Lane tracks that snapped off. Obviously, they're not going to be used because I am going to be replacing them for this build. Also, while on the topic of the tracks, one thing I forgot to mention before is, since I am going to be replacing the stock tracks I found on this model, what am I going to be replacing them with? Well, just like with the last M113 rebuild that I've done, the tracks are going to be replaced with a set of single-piece vinyl tracks from AFV Club. These tracks proved to be a really good addition on the last M113 rebuild that I've done, and for this vehicle here, I'm not expecting anything different. The sprockets appear to be the exact same spec as the ones on the Academy, so they should time perfectly well with the AFV Club replacement tracks. The one thing that I did notice, however, on the last rebuild was that the stock AFV Club rubber tracks are long by an extra length. Because of that, if you just mount them directly to the vehicle as is, you're going to have some excessive flop to the tracks, and it can hurt the look of the build. On the last model, I went ahead and shortened the tracks by amputating a link from this section over here. By doing this, this was able to tighten up the track tension to a manner which was more representable. I'm not sure if this vehicle is going to have the same issue, but if it does, it's one that can easily be addressed. And of course, we'll be going over that as the video progresses. Alright, so you can see that the vehicle is now fully sealed up, and at this point here, it's basically ready to take its bath. The side skirt has also been removed at this time, which will make the paint stripping process a little bit easier. The side skirt removal was a very simple process. All I had to do was go in here with my finger and just lift up, and the old glues were easily subdued. The side skirts themselves are going to be tied together with a piece of wire. Luckily, these footman loops here make a really convenient location to attach the wire, and then they could be submerged along with the vehicle separately in the bath. While I'm at it, I might as well start plucking off some of the other equipment found on the top, like the pickaxe here. Let's see if, yep, pops right off. It's a good idea for me to do this at this time because once I start going there and start scrubbing with that paintbrush that I typically use, these pieces are not going to hold up very well, and they're just going to get plucked off and possibly lost in that solution. And by the way, even though it's literally a bucket, trying to find stuff in that solution when it's all that soupy color, it's a bit tricky. The stuff eventually does settle, but there is some sediment on the ground right now of that bucket, and trying to find them, pick it through, it's like basically trying to find something, you know, buried in sand at the beach. So if I could avoid that as much as possible, you know, I might as well. And it's not like these pieces here are giving me too much resistance. As you see, they're just popping directly off. When it comes time to prying these pieces off, you do want to be pretty careful. You don't want to be overzealous with it and just start hacking away. You just want to get the piece wedged and then just apply just a little bit of pressure where it needs to be. And then the piece should then just pop directly off. This is basically, again, because the old school Tesser's red tube model glue was used. If you were using something like super glue or some of the other cements that are out there, you probably have a little bit more difficulties. Alright, that I'll worry about after the bath. And you know what? Yeah, let me go ahead and pluck these off too while I'm at it. Alright, so these pieces here are going to be stored in a separate Ziploc bag. And now that the model has been departed, I guess would be a interesting word I just invented to summarize this. At this point here, I could go ahead and get this guy submerged in solution. Before the model takes its plunge, of course, I have to go over the court-ordered safety briefing. This is denatured alcohol. This material here is pretty serious, so you don't want to be a horse's ass around it. Take the proper safety precautions. If you notice I'm wearing rubber gloves, normally this is more or less for showmanship, but for this process here, it actually has a purpose. You want to protect your eyes, so wear a pair of safety goggles, and you also want to avoid the fumes. This stuff here can be quite pungent, and so you want to utilize this in a well-ventilated area. Furthermore, obviously, guys, don't drink this stuff. You know, it sounds ridiculous, but, you know, there's one idiot out there that will gladly take the challenge. Don't be that guy. Don't drink it. Use your head. And with that, we can finally progress with getting this thing rebuilt. Alright, so here we go. Probably one of my favorite part on these rebuild videos. Taking the plunge in 3, 2, 1. And down she goes. Okay. The model's fully sitting on the bottom of the bucket. It's on a nice even keel, which means the entire vehicle is going to be thoroughly coated with the solution, thus making the paint removal process a little bit more efficient. Let me go ahead and drop the side skirts in. Alright, so the vehicle's in, so is the side skirts. The small bits of equipment here, I may or may not use the stripping process on them. The paintwork on them isn't bad. It's not like it's thick or chunky or anything like that. And also, these pieces are mostly spray painted. Not so much the jerry cans, but the remainder of the tools. They are spray painted with flat black, so because of that, the denatured alcohol is going to have absolutely no effect on that. Denatured alcohol works really good on acrylic and latex paints. For enamels like spray paints and Model Master, not so much. So with that in mind, these guys here I could set aside for another time, and I could go ahead, cap this fella up, put him on the dark recessed corner of the shop, because obviously something like this is definitely something that you can accidentally kick. Another benefit of sealing it up is that it cuts off any of the aromas from exiting the bucket and polluting the shop. So at this point here, I could set him aside and let the denatured alcohol run its course. So nothing much more to do. I'll go back to my daily grind, and I'll catch you guys again in a number of hours. Alright, so what appears to be instantaneous for anyone watching this video, this clip here is actually filmed 3 days after the events that were in the previous scene. So here I have the same bucket, the model's still inside, I've yet to open it since then, and I have my rough bristle paintbrush over here, which is going to be used for the actual stripping process. So there's the model, exactly the same condition as we last left it. Although it doesn't look like the paint has been flaking off or anything, I guarantee you the second this paintbrush here makes contact with the model, the paint is just going to disintegrate away. Like I may have stated before, the model was painted with a mixture of Tamiya and I believe Model Master acrylics. So both of these materials are heavily susceptible to the denatured alcohol. Also, I don't remember if or if not the model was dull coated, as this was a procedure that I used to do for a long time, but I don't think that's really going to be that relevant. So let's just start with the vegetables first, and that will be the side skirts that we have here. So one little dip, and then, and lo and behold, the paint is just melting right off, revealing the kit's original plastic coloring, which is this dark drab coloring. And if anyone has ever built any of the Italeri kits before, this plastic should look very familiar to you. Okay, so with the paint stripped off thoroughly on both sides of the fender, this one here is all set. Obviously, the denatured alcohol made really short work of this procedure. So, I'm going to go ahead and take care of the other fender off camera. There's no real reason to get that on film. And then I'm going to cut across to when the model is finally getting its paint stripping done. Well, like I stated before, with the second fender now fully paint stripped, it's time to dig into the main event. Guess I should take the turd off first. Okay, I'll put that in the solution. Now, let's dig in. It's a little awkward trying to get in here, but it's, you know, slowly but surely the paint is coming off. As you can see, the ballast tank here has been pretty much taken care of. Is at this point here, by the way, is when you tend to see components breaking off on you. Like I said, stripping the paint off is a pretty tough procedure on these models, specifically when using a stiff bristle brush like this. You can easily knock a piece off, specifically with the old glues in hand. And by the way, you have to get the paint off. The stiff bristle brush is the best way to do so. If it's soft, it's just not going to have that abrasive capability that you really need to get the paint off the surface. Guess at this point here I can start breaking off the tracks. They're not going to be needed anymore. I would say that they did a job well done, but that would be lying. So it would be best if I could take the wheels off. Let's see if I could do that. Oh, fantastic. It looks like I did not glue the wheels on for one reason or another, but that was something that could be very helpful. Okay, the whole idler mount just ripped right off. Shouldn't be too hard to repair that, but that is something to keep aware of. Sprocket? No, it's not going anywhere. That's going to take a little bit more finagling, but I'll take care of that as the video goes on. Obviously, with the wheels removed, I now have unhindered access to the lower extremities of the vehicle's hull. At this time here, you can also see the detailing found on the lower portion here. Notice, unlike the Tamiya kit, the Italeri version does have the torsion bar details, as well as the shock absorber details fully rendered out. Ah, well, at least the sprocket came off of this side. Okay, well, that idler there takes care of the last of the running gear. There are a few wheels, like 2 or 3 or so, that fell off during the paint stripping process. They are currently residing in this green soup that we have here. So obviously those are going to have to be continued once all the sediment settles, and I can actually see where the hell things are in that pail. So with the running gear out of the way, I can now progress further on the hull itself. Oh, well, look at that. Well, that solves that problem, right? Looks like I lost the tow hitch on the rear ramp here, but again, it shouldn't be too hard to track down. I do have everything in this bucket. However, for whatever reason, I can't find the piece. Luckily, I do have a mold on hand where I can cast replacement tow hitches, so not all is lost. You'll also notice that although the denatured alcohol works swimmingly on acrylic and latex paints, for paints that are enamel based or spray paint like we have here, it literally does absolutely nothing to it. So luckily these models here are not fully painted with any sort of enamels, which is why this solution here works perfectly for the last builds that I've done in a row. You can also see on the bottom of the Italeri kits, there are more details compared to some of the other kits of the contemporary period, namely the Academy and the Tamiya versions. Namely, we have right here 2 axis hatches that are present on this vehicle. On both the other releases, like as I've stated in the other videos, the tanks were originally designed to be motorized, and because of that, you do have motorization holes found on the bottom. I was finally able to remove the sprocket on the other side. Unfortunately, it resulted in me breaking the piece. However, this should not be too hard for me to repair. Don't really need this on here anymore. Okay. Oh, that's weird. It looks like I actually went ahead and did a repair on this many years ago. That probably explains why this little slot here is exposed. Probably did the repair in the wrong location or something. Interesting. That is one thing that's cool about doing these rebuilds, is that occasionally, I stumble into small little quirks and things that I made to these models, when I first built them. I believe on the Sherman that I recently rebuilt, I discovered that the brush guards in the front were fabricated out of metal wire. Probably because, I broke them during the assembly or paint or who knows. But yeah, it's just, you know, it's cool to rediscover things like that that you yourself did, you know, many years ago. I will say that this one so far seems to be the cleanest of all of the 113s that I've rebuilt so far, both in terms of the weld beads like I mentioned before, but also with the glue marks. If we recall on the Fist V, that thing was just littered with a bunch of fingerprint glue marks on it. So much so that it's like if I ever committed a crime, you could have basically did fingerprint dusting on it and you would have had a full set. Seems only fitting. It's like, who exactly is the culprit that built that model to that condition, right? Well, we're coming to the end of the road here on the hull itself. Paint is pretty much washing away pretty well. We do have some areas of spray paint popping through, and I remember this from being just overspray from when I spray painted the inside of this model. Fortunately, the overspray is just that. It's just very finely misted overspray, so it's not going to cause any problems in terms of thicknesses or any other sort of blemishes that can be seen once the model enters back into its repaint. It's going to be really interesting to see exactly how much damage occurs to the turret when I go through the painting process, or I should say the stripping process, because obviously the hull already has a number of casualties on it. It's going to be interesting to see how the turret pans out. Specifically with the Vulcan. That thing doesn't exactly look all that sturdy. Not necessarily sturdy, but doesn't look all that robust, specifically when hitting it with something like this. Miraculously, though, the brush guard survived, and the headlights. That was, I would have actually bet against that. Alright, well, I think that's it for the hull. You can see it's basically stripped down to bare plastic, and if it's not bare plastic, it's because it's hit with either overspray or there are areas that just seem to be encased in glue for one reason or another. Or is that just, no, that's not glue, it's actually green, squadron green putty. So yeah, from here I could let this guy, set him aside, let it sit, let it vent and dry out, and progress onto the turret now. Looks like the dome popped off. That's okay. Makes it easier to strip anyway. There she blows. Alright, this one I'm going to have to be a little bit gingerly with it. Well, the antenna is gone, so that was to be expected. Shouldn't be too hard to replicate, though. Okay, unlike the running gear and some areas on the hull, with this one here, I'm going to be going, or attempting to go much more delicately, I should say, over it. For reasons that should be pretty obvious. Because I really don't want this thing just disintegrating in my hand. I do have to do some repairs to this, specifically since I need to make that alteration for the gun elevation. But it would be really beneficial if I had everything intact, as opposed to trying to piecemeal it together, since it, you know, disintegrates in my hand. And then I have to go and fish pieces out of this soup here, so. Okay, there goes the seam. This piece here was two separate halves that were glued together, and you can see the green putty seam that I have here, along with some really egregious glue marks. So, looks like that's going to be cleaned up. Not too hard to do, but, you know, just one thing on the to-do list. Well, I'm actually very happy to report that I was able to get the turret here successfully paint stripped. There are a few small areas that still have paint on it here and there, but it shouldn't be a problem in order to proceed from this point further, and I don't see it going to be an issue once the model goes through its repainting process. So, you know, I'm just going to count my lucky stars on this one and just move along. So all that remaining now is to wait for the soup to settle down, and that'll allow me then to play Jacques Cousteau to go ahead and recover the remaining bits that fell off of this model that are needed in order to complete the repair. Immediately following the previous scene, I went ahead and wanted to address the ballast tanks. Like I said before, they need to have been removed for the mistakes I mentioned earlier. In order to pop them off with the X-Acto knife, I went ahead and found a corner on both sides where there really wasn't any glue and it was a good opening. I was able to stick the knife in there, and with a little bit of leverage as well as a little bit of persuasion, I was able to pop the glue seams off. The red tube glue did give way. However, it wasn't exactly a clean cut and there was a little bit of collateral damage. If you look on the side hull here, you can see the glue remnants where the parts were attached. This is true again for both sides. And on the ballast tanks themselves, luckily the break wasn't too bad. I didn't put a gouge or anything else into the bottom portion, and I didn't exactly snap or bend the piece, which would have been complete destruction of the component. However, there was some damage found on this top portion that we have right here. On the top portion of the Italeri piece, there was a small little strip molded in, which gave you the detailing for the mounting strap that is found on these parts. Unfortunately, this strip here was obliterated during the removal process, but again, it was a necessary evil that I had to do in order to take these pieces off of the model. The parts, luckily, are fairly easily repaired. I'm going to just replace them outright with a thin strip of sheet styrene, or styrene strip, I should say. However, the details that were originally found on the strip here, I believe, are small, little finely molded fasteners. These I'm not going to be able to replicate due to the small scale that they are found in. But I could at least have the strip in place, which by and large will restore the model to a better degree compared to just leaving it blank. So this is a concession that I am willing to live with. However, obviously, before I can start with the repair process, the first thing I need to do is to polish away the glue as well as the little plastic shard remnants that are left on the sides here. This is best done with some sandpaper and a little bit of elbow grease. Well, with the aid of a file, a razor blade, and with some wet sanding, I was able to polish away the glue and plastic shards that were remaining on the sides of the hull. However, I'm not quite done yet. If I hold the unit up to the light, I don't know if it's going to come out on camera, but, well, first and foremost, you can see that's nice and smooth. All of that clunk is blended away. But there are some small little divots found here or there, just sporadically on the surface of where the ballast tanks were originally. These are leftover traces of the weld marks that I sculpted on with the Dremel that I mentioned earlier on in the video. This is something I want to address at this point here because obviously, really, why not? Once the ballast tanks go on, you're not really going to get access to those locations. Now, to get rid of it, I could use one of two methods. Both of them are going to require the use of some wet sanding for final polishing, but I could either go in there with some thick super glue and just add it to the locations and polish away, or I can use the red putty. This is the same red putty that I've mentioned on many of my videos as of late. It's basically the same stuff as red modeling putty or squadron green putty, only you just get a ton of it, and for a price that's a lot less than the other options that I just mentioned. For this procedure, I'm going to go ahead and on this build use the red putty to repair, or I should say fill in, the small little carve-outs that I just mentioned. To apply it, it's just done with my finger. And I'm just going to go ahead and add a nice thin smear to the locations where the divots were found. With this stuff, you want to go in nice thin layers for two reasons. First, it really helps the material when it's in nice thin coats because it dries faster. Also, you don't run the risk of melting and causing damage to the plastic. This stuff here is tooling based, and just like with Squadron Green Putty, if you add a large glob of it, it can harm the surrounding areas on the polystyrene material. Also, with the depth of these small pits that I'm removing, adding a big blob of it is not really necessary. Usually you add a little bit more is when you're dealing with holes that are deeper in size, but that's just not the case here. So nice quick little smear is really all that's going to be required. We'll do the same thing to the opposite side. There we have this. I'm going to go ahead, set this aside, and let it dry fully. And now I can turn my attention to working on the ballast tanks. On the ballast tanks, the first thing I'm going to do is to square off the bottom portion. With the way the pieces were removed, I have chunks of glue as well as green putty found on the surfaces here, which are going to cause issues when it comes time for putting the component back on the flat side of the model. If I use this file here as a gauge, you can see that it sticks up in a couple locations back here and possibly in the front. Now, luckily, it's not too much of material I have to remove, so basically just a few passes up and down on the file here should be suffice for taking care of this. The next thing I need to worry about are some of the craters. Well, it's actually not too bad on this one, but like on this one here, we have like a small little gouge found in this little section here. And this is something that's going to need to be addressed. To do this, first I need to amputate fully the strip that I mentioned before. With that out of the way, it will give me a better view of the material at hand to see if there's any other bodywork I need to take care of. So while I'm doing the bodywork on the side, the next thing I'm working on are re-etching the edges of the panels that we have here. Unlike the other examples of the M113 that I've already done rebuilds on, where the sides were heavily chewed up with faux weld detailing that I added with a Dremel, on this model here, I didn't really use that procedures, which is to my benefit because it makes clearing them out a little bit easier. However, during the assembly process, some glue as well as some green putty were puddled up in these areas over here, which throws off the definition of these plates. On this side here, I was able to clean them up. And you can see once done, it really does improve the look of the model. This was done to both the top, the back, as well as the front. In order to do this procedure, I take just a square needle file like this, or a flat needle file like this, I should say. Square would work too. And I just basically just go up and down these surfaces here until the putty and the glue chip away, and then the unit just polishes down just from the surfaces of the file. The procedure does work, however, it's not uncommon to when you're scratching or etching the line for you to accidentally veer off and possibly put a small little nick or a gouge into the side panel. This did happen on this side, but when I mean a gouge, it's nothing serious. Tis really just a flesh wound, and it's one that's easily taken care of with just a little smear of red putty, and then the wet sanding will take care of it from there. While on the putty, you'll notice that on the rear tin work here, I added another little swipe just to remove the excessive gap found on where these two units make contact with the hull. On the 113s, these rear fenders here are pretty much welded to the vehicle, so there's no real seam line to be found. They're actually pretty seamless type installation. But on the model here, this is going to be taken care of with just a small little drop of putty. Then, with the wet sanding, I'll be able to blend it in nice and smooth. So with this side here, I got lucky compared to the one on the opposite side. I didn't really gouge it. Yeah, maybe a little bit up here. But again, nothing much that a little bit of hand polishing could easily take care of. So I'm going to let the putties dry, fully sand them down, and then I could commence with the remainder of the rebuild. On the ballast tanks here, touching back briefly on that, you'll notice that on the little panel lines, there was some sculpted weld beads that were added. These need to have been removed. This was done with the needle file like I touched upon before. I was able to do the job pretty well on this one over here. This one, I was able to get these two okay. This one, not so much. I veered off slightly during the sanding process and widened the seam a little bit more than I wanted to, but it's, again, nothing that's irreversible. Once the putty is fully dry, polish that down, and the piece is going to be good as new. After that, we can then go ahead and remount these, hopefully in the appropriate location on the second time around, as opposed to when I first built it as a kid. Off screen, I went ahead and took care of the last of the bodywork, leaving for the sides to be as smooth as you can see. And the hull lines now are nice and redefined as the way they were originally. One other thing that I did off camera was I went ahead and removed the clunk of putty that was inside this exhaust port over here. If I'm not mistaken, I believe this exhaust port is for a generator which powers the electrical system for the Vulcan system. But regardless for what it is, it was plugged up pretty bad with the green putty from when I first built the model. And luckily the green putty is very easily removed. I just poked around in there with a square needle file and it just chipped away into the appropriate location. So overall, it's a very clean removal. Not just was the bodywork completed on the hull, but also on the ballast tank, like I mentioned before. At this point here, these components are ready for their reinstallation. For the installation, this was something that's a bit tricky on these M163s because there really are no artifacts found on the sides of the kit here that tell you where the piece goes on, nor are there any indexing holes that you need to drill out that, again, properly index these pieces to the vehicle. It's hard to say because I really don't have the instructions on hand. And from what I remember when I built this back in the day, it was basically, you know, up to your guess on exactly where the pieces go. However, I was able to look online, and you should see some pictures popping up on the side over here of real M163s. And with these images, I was able to basically see where the ballast tanks gotta go. With the side skirts, I was able to mark the line where the top portion of the side skirt goes with a pencil. And then with that indication point labeled out, I was then able to line up the ballast tank appropriately and then mark both the rear portion as well as the top portion. With this information in hand, this is going to streamline quite a bit the reinstallation of these components because I'm not going to be shifting and moving the component around, which will obviously leave for glue marks. The next thing we're going to tackle is the suspension. Like I mentioned before, when I first built the model, I really didn't assemble the suspension properly, and it led to some issues, namely with the wheel alignment. During the paint stripping process, the wheels did suffer a bit of damage during this procedure, but of course it was for the best because I needed to get access to this area here in order to do the rebuild. Focusing in on over here, you could probably see this suspension piece, and notice it's not even making contact with the side of the hull. Stuff like this is what you have to watch out for when you're building tanks with individual suspension, because you can easily mess up the insulation and it'll throw off your alignment. On some of the wheels, or I should say on some of the swing arms, I've been going through the process of revising and repairing them, and you'll see that I got the idler wheel remounted on. The idler wheel was permanently attached to the swing arm, and I didn't see a reason to try to remove it any further. Luckily, in order to paint and weather this, I can easily get around this area over here without too much problem. So I was able to just reinstall it pretty easily. This swing arm over here was also repaired. It popped off like the other ones that I mentioned. In order to repair it, I'm going to be using the same procedure that I'm about to show. Basically, I have to remove the clunk that's found into these recesses over here, which are a combination of both the red tube model glue as well as portions of the plastic themselves. Now, I haven't built a Italeri M163 since this one here, so I'm not sure if this is what really caused the problem when I built this one, but I do recall something like this on the M47s, where these pieces do require a slight bit of hand fitting in order to get them to fit on properly. If you just snip them off the runner and try to insert them into their locations, they may or may not fit. So for these ones here, because there's this little clump over here, this needs to be removed, as well as a little bit of cleanup needs to be done on this portion over here. Once this is done, the piece will then fit on in a much more appropriate manner. If I take this one here, this is the appropriate one that I was just talking about. If I just line it up to the broken glue seam, you can see that it just sticks above past the surface. So this is one of the ones that I'm going to showcase on how to actually repair. The other ones, I'm not sure if I'm going to show them on tape, or on video I should say, because, well, it's going to be the same procedure, just rinse, wash, and repeat. For this one here, because it has the shock absorber that extends out from it, the only thing I want to mention besides doing the same steps that I'm going to be showing, you just go over this portion here with a little bit of sandpaper, removing the extra little bit of glue found on the surface, just to ensure that the piece sits on flush. With all of the torsion bars now mounted, you can see exactly how much better the vehicle is starting to look and how it's beginning to take shape again. Like I mentioned before, if you hold up the vehicle in a certain angle, you'll see all of the torsion bars in line with each other, which is exactly what you want to see. And it's a mirror image on the opposite side. Again, exactly what you want to view when you look at torsion bars like this. This leads us directly to the wheels. The wheels on this table here have been mostly cleaned up from before, because with the way the models first built with the individual link track, there were some areas on the wheels where there were some glue marks and some glue clumps where obviously the glue was used in order to attach the tracks to the road wheels. Most of the wheels here have been cleaned up. This is easily done with just a needle file and X-Acto, and just a few swipes in some areas here or there. It's really all you need to really bring them back to where they need to be. Off camera, I basically took care of all of the row wheels with the exception of maybe one or two. Here's one of them right here, and here you can see some of the clumps that I was talking about. Obviously, something like this is going to need to be addressed. I'm going to go ahead and address this off camera. There's nothing really much to show. Basically, I just go in there with the needle file here and just polish it away until the glue is no longer present. The other wheel, though, that I am going to show a little bit more in depth on me fixing is one of these here, and I'll show you exactly why in a second. This wheel here was properly assembled, and this one here wasn't. With the way the kit is designed, it's just like many other M113 kits out there where you have the rear half and the forward half, and they're two separate pieces that you just glue together, and you now have your wheel. Well, this one here went together without any problems, but this one here, for whatever reason, I screwed up with the assembly. The piece was glued on, but for some reason, the two halves were not properly lined up, and so the piece kind of dried in this type of a format. This is a common problem, by the way, on many military model kits, and something you have to be careful for. It's one of those things where if you pay attention, you're not going to make that mistake, but it's one that can possibly happen, specifically if you're more of a novice type builder, which was exactly the story when I built this one. If you look at the wheel here, you'll notice that it's a little bit wider than it really should be, and of course that's only on one side. On the bottom portion here, hopefully it's a little bit tricky to get on camera, of course, but the bottom portion is narrower compared to this section on top. Generally, this type of a problem isn't one that's too big of a deal on a vehicle like this because it is static. Once it goes into its appropriate location and when the track and the side skirt get mounted on, it's one that's not going to be very noticeable. However, it's just one of those things that's really bugging me, so I'm going to go ahead and get this repaired before I can progress any further. In order to repair the wheel, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the unit in half, square it off, and then reassemble it. There's a multitude of tools that you use for this, from a hacksaw to a X-Acto saw. A bandsaw would do the job just fine, but I'm going to utilize the Multimax. The reason why I'm using this tool instead of the other ones I just mentioned is because of the blade thickness. On my bandsaw that I have right now, the blade's a little bit on the thicker end, and if I use that on this, it'll do the job, but I think it's going to remove too much material, which will then have the adverse effect of making the wheel then too narrow. You are going to lose a little bit of material doing this. That's one of the byproducts of doing this type of a procedure, but it's one that, again, should yield for some good results in the final outcome of the build. So, the Multimax, I'm going to go at a nice slow speed. One advantage about this tool is that it doesn't really remove the type of material that it would on a traditional type of saw, and because of that, the cut's going to be finer, and you're not going to lose as much material compared to the other methods that I just mentioned. So, from here, let's go ahead and turn this thing on and get cutting. I'm going to go at a slower speed to reduce the amount of plastic melt. And let's see if this works. Oh, by the way, one nice thing about this tool here, it doesn't cut human flesh. So you can do this freehand and not worry about any sort of accidental trips to the doctor's office. While slowly cutting the wheel, I realized that I didn't have to fully cut the wheel in half in order to correct the problem. If I use my hands here as a rough guide as how this was done, basically the trench was cut into this portion over here where the problem occurred. But on the quarter portion of the wheel, I left it intact. With that material now removed, I was able to then bend and contort the wheel back to its appropriate width. If I go ahead and compare that here with a properly assembled wheel, you'll see that the widths are exactly where they need to be. From here, I'm going to add a small little drop of super glue in order to solidify that trench, keeping the wheel with the new proportions. And then, of course, once it gets installed, painted, weathered, and the track and the side skirt gets fitted, the piece is going to blend in absolutely perfectly with the rest of the model. With the CA added, the wheel is now fully repaired, and I can set this aside. And now this leads us to the sprockets. The sprockets, of course, are the kit originals, and during the removal process, or I should say the paint stripping process, one of the sprockets came off in an intact manner. However, the other one, not so much. These sprockets are going to be recycled and still used on this build, because even though the piece does have a broken stem, it can still be repaired, and I'll show exactly how I do that in a second. As for the sprockets themselves, I did clean them up slightly because during the original assembly of the kit, of course with the individual link and lengths, you are going to have to add drops of glue to certain sprocket teeth in order to put the little links in place, which never works in practice. However, in theory, that's how they're supposed to be done. Unfortunately, because this, when you remove the dreaded link and length tracks, you are going to have some glue marks remaining on the sprocket that need to go in order to clean it up so that it can have a proper set of single piece tracks added. The glue was simply just polished away with an X-Acto and a needle file and maybe a little bit of sandpaper. Basically, you know, the holy trinity of modeling tools over here just to clean them up, and by and large it did a really good job. So from here we're ready for the remainder of the reinstallation, or I should say the repair. On the tank here, this final drive is for this unit and just fits directly in place. One nice thing about the Italeri kit is that it has a nice deep stem for the final drive, and that's great because it adds a lot of stability and a lot of surface area to prevent the sprocket from wobbling. And this is definitely going to be appreciated once the single piece vinyl track gets put on. The one on the opposite side, the stem is permanently cracked on the inside here, and it's glued in. Oddly enough, of all of the red tube glue, this is the one part that didn't break off on the model, but that's okay. Over here, a hole was drilled in, I believe, and this hole here is a 1/16 of an inch. And if anyone have watched the other M113 rebuilds that I've done, you probably know how I'm going to fix this. On those other builds, I took a 1/16 of an inch steel rod, and I drilled a small little hole on one side, and in a corresponding hole on the opposite version. Then, when it came time for assembly, this rod gets installed onto the tank, the sprockets get glued to the rod, and then the unit is held in place nice and firmly due to having a steel rod support. Well, for this model here, we're going to be doing that exact same system, but it's going to be slightly different because for this one here, this stem here does need to be cut off or anything. But this, due to this nice beefy chunky stem here, it's going to be the perfect place for me to secure the other end of the 6/7 inch rod. And that's really important because this is actually going to be the anchor point for the other sprocket. You see, if I just go ahead and drill out a hole here, that's 1/16 of an inch, and add the rod in place, it'll fit inside this unit perfectly fine. And it may have enough meat on it to keep it in place. However, by anchoring and securing it to the one on the opposite side, this really gives a nice strong securing point that'll keep that sprocket exactly where it needs to be, and it'll prevent any sort of wiggle or any other type of problems that can possibly pop up. For my long-term viewers who have seen my other 113 videos before, this here should be very familiar because I'm going to be utilizing the exact same system. This here is a 1/16 of an inch drill bit put into my drill press, which I'm going to go ahead to use to bore out the material on the sprockets in order to secure the axle in place. The reason why I use the drill press is because this ensures me a nice, even, straight hole, which is exactly what you want when you want something like an axle. If you do not have a drill press, the exact same procedure can be done with a Dremel or a pin vise with, of course, a 1/16 of an inch drill bit. These drill bits are literally found in any hardware store, so tracking one down is not a problem. The pin vise is probably one of the safest methods to use in order if you're drilling these out, if you haven't done this procedure before, because this allows you to personally remove as much material in a nice, slow, concise manner, and this will prevent any over-drilling, which can possibly harm the look. For this build here, I like to live dangerously, so I'm going to use the drill press, and also I've done it enough times that I hopefully should be able to do this via muscle memory and not drill them out all the way. For this one here, it's not as much of a risk because of this very large lump of plastic that we have here on the end. It's a lot of material that I could easily drill into. The risk comes with this one here where the stem was removed. So I'm going to have to be extremely careful when I'm drilling this out. But with that, all that out of the way, let's go ahead and remove some material. Once the holes are drilled out, the steel rod gets inserted, and as you can see, this thing here is really nicely attached. It still has full rotation capability to it, which is exactly what you want. Not because I'm going to play with it or anything, but when it comes time to putting on the vinyl track, if the pieces have some roll to them, this really makes the installation go by much easier. If I go ahead and yank these apart, here you can see the setup. Right now, no glue is actually used, and honestly, I don't think I'm going to be adding any glue either. The friction fit is so tight that it holds the pieces in place absolutely perfectly. On this one here, I was really close to over drilling the piece. You can see a small little white section in the center hub here of the sprocket, but it didn't overextend too much where it would have popped out. And even if it would have, the piece, I should say the wire, once sanded down and squared off, would have blended in absolutely perfectly. So either way, it's still a win. With the model now fully completed, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. Starting with the model suspension, here you get to see what the suspension looks like since the rebuild process. Note all of the road wheels are in a straight line format, and the swing arms are also appropriately lined up. This was important to mention because, as we can recall, when I first built the model, these pieces were basically all over the place. And another thing I do want to touch upon is that since I rebuilt this model over here, I also went ahead and built a factory fresh Italeri M163 kit. And when going through that build, I noticed that the swing arms do need to have a little bit of hand fitting in order to appropriately get them assembled. So this wasn't just a mistake that I made when I was younger. This is something that is inherent on the Italeri 113 family kits, and it's one that can easily be done by the builder. Just when you're assembling them, make sure to take your time to hand fit these pieces to make sure that all the swing arms line up appropriately. If you do that, the suspension will look 10 times better. From the wheels takes to the sprockets, and here you get to see how they're holding up since the previous scene. Like I stated before, the steel rod was a really good design in order to resecure the sprocket to the model and keep it on in a really strong manner. The sprockets are having absolutely zero problems with holding up with the tension found on the single piece vinyl tracks. And while on the tracks, the AFV Club single piece track is an excellent choice. Like I stated before, in case you have an M113 family of vehicle that is cursed with the individual link and length, and you actually want to get the model assembled and assembled properly. The tracks go on in the exact same manner, and actually are painted and weathered in the exact same manner as I touched upon in the Fist V video. But the difference, though, is that with this one being an Italeri kit, while the other one being an Academy, there may have been a timing issue with the tracks. Well, I'm happy to note that that just wasn't the case. The tracks timed pretty well with the Italeri sprockets, and the installation went by pretty problem-free. On the tracks themselves, I did glue them to the top portion of the road wheels. as I touched upon in the Fist V video, although they're not exactly really easy to see behind the side skirts. However, if you see the model in just the right angle, you can definitely see the top portions of the teeth right on top of the road wheels, which is exactly what you would expect to see on the real vehicle. And of course, this being an M113, I have to point out that the rear idler here is a metal rim section. So when you're building one of these models with a little swipe of silver paint, you can add it to the faces, which would replicate the worn look that would be extremely common on vehicles that have been driven. Also, on a similar note, you can see the side skirts. Like I frequently mention in these videos, the side skirts are rubber on the real M113 with 2 stamped sheet metal end plates. And on the model here, I just simply painted and weathered it to replicate that type of material. These pieces are also often overpainted when the vehicles go through their repainting phase, so it's not uncommon to see these pieces overpainted with the base or camouflage pattern of one flavor or another. But if you are going to go with that route, be advised that the paint would chip off the rubber sections almost immediately. So if you're going to go with that type of format, you do want to weather the pieces accordingly. Aside from the repair needed to the rear towing implements, the rear ramp itself also received a bit of repair. Like I touched upon before at the beginning of the video, the rear ramp was basically trashed at the start of the rebuild, which is not uncommon again for an M113 pattern vehicle in that type of condition. The hinges that you see here were completely replaced with resin copies that were made from the other Italeri M113 that I was touching upon before. So visually, the pieces look completely intact, and as they would if the model was brand new. Unfortunately, even though the hinges were replaced, the functionality was not restored because several of the other hinge points that were found on the hatch itself were just completely toast. So rather than trying to make a mold of the entire rear ramp or to possibly try to repair the hinges themselves, it was easier to just model the unit in the closed position. Just like I touched upon on the other M113 rebuilds that received a similar type of repair, because this model here does not have any interior detailing, the feature of the rear ramp being functional was just not necessary. So on this model here, nothing was lost by modeling it in the closed state. From the ramp takes to the other amenities such as the tow cable and the 2 jerry cans. All 3 of these components were the kit original ones and were simply just recycled. The components were in pretty good shape, so really no other polishing was needed to have been made to them outside of cleaning them up a little bit and then giving them a quick little repaint. From there, however, takes us to the 2 taillights. The taillights on the Italeri M113 pattern of vehicles has an interesting quirk that I neglected to mention in the other 113 video. And that is, if you follow the instructions, the taillights, when mounted, are going to be in a canted manner. This is something that is also found on the blackout light where the pieces are inverted, but I'll touch upon that in a moment. In order to properly fit the taillights on this model, all you got to do is snip off the little mounting peg found molded into the rear of the taillight, and then you just mount the taillight to the appropriate location without the stem. Without that stem in place, you can then adjust the taillight to the proper orientation. As for the taillights themselves, they're painted in your standard format. The cat's eye on the one on the left is red, while the bottom light is painted in silver, and the one on the opposite side has the same silver painting on the bottom, but the top portion is a blackout light, so you paint it in black. On top of the taillights, we have these 2 brush guards here. These were completely trashed at the beginning of the video, and I believe one of them was just straight up missing. So again, this is where the other M113 came in handy to be a donor, where I was able to make a rubber mold and cast 2 fresh replacements. Once the replacements were added, the pieces were basically as good as new. Moving to the front takes to the 2 spare track links. These track links that you see here are one of the Lincoln lengths, actually from, I believe, the other M113 that I built before. You see, the kit does supply you with a length of tracks to be used as spares. However, the molding and details are not as good as the individual Lincoln lengths that are supplied with the kit. Well, since the Lincoln lengths were pitched for these rubber ones, I do have quite a few of the individual links floating around. So rather than having them languish away in the dustbin where they belong, I actually went ahead and gave them a reprieve by using them as the 2 spare links found on the front. In order to mount them, they just simply go in place of the other ones, but to paint them, I went ahead and utilized my typical format. On the 113, the middle section here is actually a rubber pad, and then the outer sections are made from metal. So I just simply weathered them accordingly. This is a simple trick to do on any M113 that will definitely enhance the look of it, as opposed to just leaving everything spray painted flat black. Adjacent from the tracks takes us to the front bow plane hinge. As we can recall from the beginning of the video, the hinge had some weird stuff going on where the piece was, I guess, broken, repaired, and it wasn't exactly repaired properly because there was a hole where the piece was supposed to plug in. Regardless, all of that was corrected, and here you get to see what the piece looks like now, fully repaired and corrected. From the bow plane takes to the blackout headlight here, and like I stated before in the other video, as well as also with the tail light on this video, the Italeri 113 family has this weird quirk where the blackout funnel is actually molded in upside down. And, well, it's a simple thing to fix. All you gotta do is with a pair of clean cut snips, you snip off the molded in section from the bottom, and you simply then just remount it on the top. Once this is done, your blackout light is good to go. Moving up takes us to the main exhaust manifold as well as the brush guard, and like I mentioned before, the kit does have this detailing supplied with the kit. Fortunately, it did not survive the paint stripping process, and frankly, I didn't really do a good job when I built the piece originally, as it was pretty beaten up. Rather than trying to salvage that part, I simply just pitched it all together and fabricated a brand new one out of thin strips of aluminum. From the exhaust manifold takes to these two little elbows found on the top deck. These are kit supplied, but are molded solid. In order to enhance them with a pin vise and a small bit, I just simply drilled both of these out. Not really sure what they're for, if they have to do with the bilge system or if they're some other type of exhaust manifold type system or a breather system. Not really sure. The only thing I know is they are hollow on the real unit, so I went ahead and replicated that detailing on the model. Briefly moving back down takes to the main ballast tanks, and here you get to see what they look like now, fully repaired and remounted to the model. Like I touched upon before, originally when I built this model, they were mounted incorrectly, and it was probably one of the biggest dings and revisions that need to have been made to this model during the rebuild process. But here you get to see what they look like now, all cleaned up. Right on top of the section over here, you can see that little bilge hole found, and it's an iconic bit of detailing found on the M113 family. This was completely covered up with the glues that were found in this section when I improperly mounted the piece. So with a small little pin vise, I simply just remounted it. The strip here was also touched upon before, and again, now that the piece is fully remounted, painted, and weathered, it just blends right in with the remainder of the model's details. On the back portion, quick little thing to touch upon is this small little bent piece of metal wire. On the real units, this is another bilge pump system, and on the model here it is kit supplied, but obviously something like that was not going to hold up during the paint stripping process, so it was just simply replaced with a small little bent piece of wire. Moving along the top deck takes to the rear indicator beacon. This detailing is not the same one that was originally found at the model at the beginning of the video. Unfortunately, when I first built that model, I really went ahead and caked it up with several layers of really thick enamel spray paint. And unfortunately, the spray paint was really, really tough. I could have possibly, if I wanted to, put the extra elbow grease in, have the piece sit in turpentine, try to, dislodge the paint, get it off that way. But rather than going through all of that, it was simpler just to replace it outright. The unit that we have here is an Italeri component, but it's from the other Italeri M113 that I built and actually already posted a video on this channel. This isn't a resin copy or anything. This is just straight up a spare from that build. With the way the Italeri kit is designed, you do have several NATO specific components on it, one of which is the indicator beacon, which is not necessary for the rendition of the M113 that I built in that video. So rather than having this nice piece languish away in the spare parts bin while the other one tries to get salvaged, I just simply went ahead and inverted that. The other one went to the spare parts bin, and this one here was just painted and then mounted to the model. From the beacon takes us to the ammunition cans, and the ammo cans are the kit originals and polished up very well. The only thing that I did on this model here is to give it a slight little tint of color, was that on the ammo cans I painted them with different colors. Keep in mind, these pieces are made by lots of different manufacturers, and there's lots of different shades of olive drab out there, and it's not uncommon to see these ammo cans in a few different shades of olive drab. And in order to give a little bit more life to the model, I simply just painted 2 of them with a slightly different shade of OD. It's a nice way to add a little bit of extra pop and color to your model. From the ammo cans takes us to the Pioneer tools. These are the kit original units. They were cleaned up, repainted, weathered, and mounted to the model. They were in pretty good condition overall, and the installation went on pretty well. With the exception of this crowbar over here, when installing it, I had this small little snafu where there was this unsightly glue mark that was in a really visible location. Rather than getting frustrated and angry and trying to repaint it, I decided to turn it into a happy accident because the proximity of the glue mark was really close to the fuel filler spout. So what I did was, with the gloss black and gloss lacquer, I basically expanded the fuel stain to encompass that glue mark. And if anyone has ever topped off a fuel tank on a very large vehicle like this, a little spillage or a lot of spillage is something that is definitely not out of the realm of reality. So aside from the spillage, the remainder of the hull is basically good to go. Like I stated before, this one here was in fairly decent condition compared to some of the other 113s that I rebuilt in the past. And this now takes us to the turret. The turret itself was built pretty decently. There was a seam found in this section over here where the 2 halves met, and the seam was corrected and polished away with the bodywork. Also, one other thing about the turret was that when I built the model, I went ahead and gave it that stupid cast texturing that I've touched upon a few of these other OTRs, where at the time I would take a Dremel with a bit and basically nick up the surface. Fortunately, the nicks weren't too rampant on this model over here. They were pretty far and few between, so repairing them was fairly easily done. This was done with a few drops of thick super glue, and then once the glue set, I just polished it away with some wet sandpaper. Once the sanding was concluded, the surface of the turret here is completely smooth, and if I didn't mention it, probably no one would have ever guessed. The next big thing to talk about was with the Vulcan elevation. Like I stated before, one quirk that this kit does have is that you're basically handcuffed with 2 variants of elevation for this system. You could either have it pointed crazy high, or you can have it in the transport mode, which looks like it got knocked out. I wanted to make it somewhere in the middle, so when I was stripping off the paint on the turret, this piece here basically fell apart, but fell apart in a controlled manner. Because of that, I was able to reconstruct everything that you see here, and I was able to readjust the elevation of the Vulcan. In order to do this, I basically took 2 pieces of Plastruct and I glued them to these 2 locations. The Plastruct changes the angle of elevation without having to do anything major to the recuperators or the hydraulics found on either side of the Vulcan. Those pieces of Plastruct, once everything is painted and weathered, just blend in with the remainder of the detailing, and so it looks like, well, nothing is really different. Some other work on the Vulcan to mention is with these 2 handles up here. During the model when it was originally built, one of these handles was broken off during construction, so I went ahead and crudely fabricated a new one out of wire. Well, during the rebuild, that was not going to fly, so that was replaced, and I fabricated 2 new handles out of thinner wire, but since then I have better tools when it comes to bending that type of media. Once the pieces were bent into shape, they were remounted in their appropriate locations and again blend in with the remainder of the detailing. Moving backward takes us to the radio as well as the MP65 antenna base. This is the kit original component, and like I mentioned before, during the paint stripping process, the top portion here cracked off. But fortunately, I don't know how, but my lucky stars lined up and I was able to find that broken piece, and once tracked down, I remounted to the MP65, completing the look that we see here. On a similar note, on the big side-mounted radar, the components were reconstructed from the following parts that I had. The only part that I was missing apparently was this little support strut that's found back here behind the dome. This piece here was fabricated out of a simple piece of Plastruct. Once mounted in place, it completes the look, and other than that, the whole radar system was fully repaired. Hopping to the paint and the weathering, this model here is obviously painted with a 3-tone NATO camouflage pattern. As for the techniques as well as with the paints themselves to bring this model up to this condition, These were identical to what I referenced in the Fist V video that is found in the OTR lineup, and I also have the link to that video found in the description listed below. Also, just like with the Fist V, you'll notice that this vehicle here has no markings on it whatsoever. This was because, for the same reason, I didn't have any appropriate markings for this model in my spare decal bin. If, however, at some point in time I were to get a set of decals that would work for this and the other vehicle, I can easily just simply add them to the model and then just add the varnish, sealing them all to the vehicle. But just like with the Fist V, even though this model here does not have any markings on it, the entire vehicle was still covered in VMS matte varnish. This was done because, well, frankly put, the varnish does a fantastic job with giving the model a nice finished look to it, as opposed to leaving the surfaces untouched. Paintwork, I briefly want to touch upon the Vulcan system. Note that the barrels are not painted with the same color as the remainder of the vehicle. The Vulcan, the barrels are detachable, and because of that would not be overpainted with the camouflage, or from the examples that I've seen. The barrels themselves would be parkerized, and in this case here you can see the weathering that has been added to them, which is not uncommon for this type of a system. The barrels are just dry brushed, and then a small little toot of flat black was airbrushed onto the barrel end for, you know, that nice little sooty effect. On the inside portion here, you can see the instrument panel. Hopefully this comes out with the lighting situation that I have, but the Italeri piece does have some decent renderings of detailing on this component here. In order to enhance that, I painted the instrument panel with a different shade of olive drab, and all the little switches and gauges were painted accordingly. By just doing this, this is an easy way to make the detailing pop from the already supplied details that are molded into the model. Same is also true for the radio, where I just went ahead and painted with a different shade of OD. And of course the MP65 is painted accordingly. On this component here, the bottom portion with all the ribs would be a reddish brown porcelain. To me, a hull red is always the best color for that. And then the top portion of the 65 is actually a flexible rubber, so flat black was simply utilized in place. In order to give the porcelain that nice little sheen, a quick little drop of Tamiya gloss lacquer was added, completing the look to the way you see it here. Also, the optic is painted a different color from the remainder of the vehicle. And if you're going to paint the optic, obviously you also want to paint the lenses. Once all these little details are painted, the model will definitely pop, as opposed to, again, leaving everything overpainted with the colors that you use for the camo and or the base. And at the end of the day, I feel completely redeemed getting this model across the finish line in this format. This was one of those builds that was always a bit of an eyesore in my collection, and it feels extremely good to finally revisit it and to correct all of those mistakes that I made when I was younger. If you made it to this point of the video, I want to say thank you and congratulations. It is a bit tricky to keep people's attention in this day and age, and perhaps if you made it to this point, that's because you do have some older builds in your collection that may have fallen to a poor state of disrepair, and rather than having them stay in that condition or even worse, end up in a trash bin, perhaps you may have learned a few techniques from this and the other OTR videos to give those models a second look, and perhaps you can polish and turn them around into a nice cornerstone of your collection. Which is precisely what I'm going to be doing with this model after the filming of this video. Then I guess from there, it's off to the old display cabinet to dig around to see if I could find another old Bosch build that is in desperate need of a rebuild. However, I'll leave that for another video for another time. And with that, that wraps up this episode of Old Tank Repair. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being old tank repair videos like this one over here, or the other smaller and larger scale model showcase videos and project update videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as the other models that have been showcased on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again. I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. Take care.